I'm Jim Anderson from Bloomberg Philanthropies, and it's such a pleasure to be here with Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot. Madam Mayor, welcome.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Jim.
It's a real pleasure to be with you today, and let me start with a huge congratulations. On June 11th, Chicago became the largest big city in America to fully reopen. I know that took a tremendous amount of hard work, and a big congrats are in order.
Well, thank you. And really, the congratulations belong to the residents of my great city who, as you know, along with people all across the world, endured a tremendous burden throughout the course of the pandemic. But really, I think buckled down, followed the science and the public health directives, and really got us to the place that we are in right now, and still continuing to work to make sure that we get more and more people vaccinated. But I'm excited, and the city is really coming alive.
That's so exciting. And it's been almost 18 months to the day since Chicago became the second city in the country with a recorded case of COVID-19. So take me back to January 24th, 2020. What was going through your head? Did you have any sense of what your city was in for? And did anything that unfolded over the next 18 months go according to plan?
Well, those are big questions. We started paying attention, our public health started paying attention to the pandemic really back in December of 19. And when it became clear that this was a very large, dangerous virus, watching it seem like it was consuming all of China, then spreading to Southeast Asia, and then leaping over to Europe, I felt like it was only a matter of time before it hit our shores. And then, of course, it did. Mostly initially seemed to be from travelers coming from China to either coast. But as we saw it, reaching the shores of California and then New York and spreading there, and then slowly but surely making its way to the Midwest, we started doing a number of different things to make sure that we were prepared. And luckily, our public health department prepares all year round, particularly when it comes to having equipment. You remember those crazy times where people were sending briefcases of cash on flights to far-flung places to find ventilators, PPE, all kinds of other basic equipment that was necessary for testing. We didn't have that problem here in Chicago. I like to think that we were one of the most prepared, not just cities, but locations in the country because of the continuous stockpiling of equipment in climate-controlled facilities, and being very, very diligent about that really set us up in a very different place than a lot of other locations across the country, including our own state government. But those were days where nobody really understood what was happening. The virus was something that people were still scrambling to understand. The guidance that we were getting from the CDC at the beginning of the pandemic, until we really had a better handle on things months later, radically different. So we were in very uncharted territory, and trying to literally do the things that we felt were necessary to try to save people's lives. Some of those early, very difficult decisions, shutting down our schools, shutting down hotels and restaurants and our convention business, those were hard, painful decisions. And even at the time, I was thinking and hoping this would be a matter of months. Never in my wildest dreams, back in February, March, did I think we would be a year plus and still not out of the throes of the pandemic.
And it's incredible to think about how much has transpired. And 18 months later, a number of your fellow mayors have decided not to run for re-election. Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms cites her decision to fatigue, exhaustion, and sadness. Yeah. So how did you manage the fatigue during that grueling 18 months? And was there ever a moment where you thought to yourself, this is too much?
Well, look, I'm pretty tough, and I'm not somebody who gives up. But I was really fortunate to have a tremendous team around me. And that's the only way that I would have ever been able to get through this. As I said, this is really uncharted territory, I think, for everybody. From the President of the United States to the world leaders, this was something that was so different, so vast, and so scary because of so many unknowns. And watching people die and the suffering that came so suddenly, like this tidal wave across the world, across our continent, was a frightening thing to behold. But my team, and particularly our great public health department and leadership, really gave me confidence to persevere. I mean, we did an all hands on deck, as many leaders did across the country and the world. I think we worked from the end of February through the end of May, 7 days a week without a break. And there were days that I would tumble into bed once I finally was able to get home, so exhausted, but unable to sleep, because just processing what had happened that day, and then knowing that there was a whole bevy of new challenges that awaited the very next day. So those were really difficult times. But for me personally, I'm very committed to making sure that I finish what I start. And my city needed me to be strong, needed me to tell it to them straight, and we really led with the data and the science, transparency, but also really focused in on equity. One of the signature moments that I will probably never forget for the rest of my life is when we started seeing the data that Black people in the city were dying at 7 times the rate of any other demographic. That was a breathtaking moment, but a moment that I knew we had to rise to the occasion and not just share bad news with people, but really come up with very concrete solutions, and we did.
And you continue to build on that progress. Last week, you declared racism a public health crisis, joining a number of other cities in doing so. What led to that declaration specifically, and how do you hope it'll make a difference?
Looking at the root causes of a lot of the healthcare and life expectancy disparities that we see, there's a straight line that leads to systemic racism. The absence of investments in healthcare, in jobs, in healthy eating options for communities of color, but also just the lack of investment in human capital. All of those things are as a result of, decades, but probably longer, of systemic racism, intentional exclusion of Black and brown poor communities from access to the wealth of this great city. So I'm a firm believer in facing hard truths, and this was one that was so obvious, so evident. And what I think it allows us to do is to really then dig into what are the root causes. How do we start righting historic wrongs? But we can't do that work without making that declaration and calling it what it is. And we also announced at the same time healthcare equity teams that were divided by geography based on place-based strategies that we're going to use to start addressing in a much more systematic way the systemic racism that has plagued our city for way too long. So it was making the declaration, but as I always like to do, coming behind that immediately with concrete solutions to solve the problem.
Yeah. In reading the coverage of your announcement, I read that you talked about your parents and how their own aspirations were stifled by the realities of the segregation in the South in the 1920s. Mm-hmm. Would they have fared better in today's Chicago?
That's a great question. In some ways, yes, in some ways, no. I think Chicago definitely over the years has offered glimmers of more opportunity than the segregated South. But as Dr. King noted when he came here in the late 60s, the racism that he faced, that was out front, the anger, and at Dr. King and other civil rights leaders having the audacity to call the racism in a city, northern city like Chicago, that resistance that led to riots against him and others, that's no different than a kind of violent racism that my parents experienced, my father growing up in Arkansas, my mother growing up in Alabama. When your whole life's function, literally your physical movements, your thoughts, your access to any kind of opportunity, and even your joy is circumscribed by racism and the fear of enraging a white population that could turn like this and snuff out your life without any fear of accountability. It's hard to even imagine living that in that environment, but that is truly the environment that both of my parents grew up in. And I think my mother, to some extent, was able to overcome it coming north and with family supports. But for my father, that shaped his entire world vision to the day that he died.
You inherited in Chicago one of the toughest gun violence crises in the nation. And like your city, like so many, is really struggling with this issue in an ongoing way. Last week, you were part of rallying mayors to urge President Biden to do more faster. What is the path forward here? And what are you hoping to see from the White House in the near term?
Well, I think has to be a multi-tiered strategy. On the ground here locally, we were focused on the 15 areas of our city that drive about 30% of our violent crime. And we believe that if we can make significant progress in those areas, that will redound to the benefit of the entire city. And incrementally, we're seeing some progress. June over June, we're definitely in a better place than we were last year, although last year was also a historic high. But year to date, we're seeing a consistent downward trend in homicides and shootings, which means we're getting traction. And one barometer that I really think is important, we're seeing a steady increase in our homicide clearance rate. You can't get there without the public believing in some level of legitimacy of the police department, because we're seeing cooperation like we haven't seen in a very long time. So that, I think, is good progress, but we've got to continue using not just hard power, but the soft power of government to be a convening force for our city agencies, to understand that all of them have skin in this game, but also to bring in community partners so that if we're able to clear a block or a corner or a location, then we build up capacity on the ground with local indigenous residents and stakeholders to hold that territory with overlay with city resources and support. So that, I think, is the long and the short and the long game for city. But you may ask the question about what can the federal government do. I think there's a tremendous amount of low-hanging fruit, and I look forward to the president's announcement on these issues. Number one, we know that in Chicago, most of the guns that are coming into our city are coming in from different states and surrounding suburban gun dealers. ATF needs to be fully empowered to do oversight of federally licensed gun dealers. We've got to make sure that they're playing it straight, playing by the rules, and that they know that there's accountability if they continue to sell to straw purchasers or cut corners in any way.
My last question to you, under the wire. You've reopened your city. Your city's coming back to life. You're probably beginning to think more about the future. What does Build Back Better mean for Chicago, and where do you see the biggest opportunity for progress?
I think we've got to demonstrate to our residents who have really been carrying extraordinary burdens over these last 15 plus months that we hear them, we see them, and we're coming with real solutions to their problems. People have to feel the recovery. The people in our communities, the small business owners, the person who's worried about whether or not they're going to be able to keep a job, the person who's seeking a job. Our focus has to be on dealing with our structural fiscal issues for sure, but if our residents don't feel this recovery in their pocketbook, if they don't feel a sense of relief that the government sees them and is willing to help, give a helping hand to help them overcome their economic fears and realities, then this will all be for naught. So we've got to get resources into communities, into individuals. So we've been doing a big examination of where are the pain points for our residents and how can we best address them.
Well, that is a great note to end on. Mayor Lightfoot, thank you very much.
My pleasure.